Close your eyes for just 1 second. I want you to imagine the absolute worst sound you could possibly hear. If you were trapped in a tight, dark space, it is not a scream. It is not the crack of a whip or the heavy footsteps of an executioner dragging a heavy axe. It is the dry, scraping, rhythmic sound of a trowel spreading wet mortar. Slap. Scrape. Another cold stone is set into place. Slap. Scrape. The only tiny sliver of light bleeding into your cramped cell is getting narrower by the second. The air is already growing heavy, suffocating, and stinking of fresh lime and ancient, damp earth. You try to scream, but your voice just bounces off the cold stone, right back into your own ears, muffled and utterly useless. What would you do if your grave was not dug into the dirt after you died, but built brick by brick around you, while your heart was still frantically beating in your chest? The horrifying truth is that this was not a rare nightmare or a twisted fiction. This is no fairy tale, this is hell on earth. Do not let movies fool you into thinking the medieval times were all about noble knights and grand glowing castles. If it were you, you would not survive 24 hours in the brutal, bloody reality of the past. Welcome to the Dark Ages. Today we are descending into the most terrifying and stinking dungeons of human history to uncover the chilling practice of immurement. A bloodless execution with no witnesses, where the darkness devours you slowly and the architecture itself becomes a ruthless weapon designed to break your mind before it kills your body. If you have the stomach to discover what happens to the human mind and a rotting body when left to decay inside a solid stone wall, you are in the right place. To understand the twisted logic behind this nightmare, we have to travel back to ancient Rome. Rome was the shining cradle of civilization, but it was also a massive stage for the most desperate and bureaucratic cruelty mankind has ever known. The safety of the Roman Empire did not just rely on massive legions and steel swords sweeping across the land. It relied entirely on the favor of the gods. And standing at the very center of this divine protection were the Vestal Virgins. They were untouchable priestesses tasked with keeping the sacred flame of the city burning bright at all times. They were incredibly powerful and lived in absolute luxury, while the commoners wallowed in human feces and open sewers in the slums. But that massive privilege came with a terrifying price tag: absolute, unbreakable chastity. If a Vestal broke the sacred vow and engaged in any sexual relations, the Romans truly believed the entire divine protection of the city would collapse and their world would be torn apart. But there was a complex legal and religious problem that the senators had to solve. Roman law strictly forbade human hands from spilling the sacred blood of a Vestal virgin. They were considered far too holy to be sent to the guillotine, strangled, or tortured by a common executioner in the public square. So the magistrates found a chilling solution with cold, calculated cynicism. If they could not legally kill her, they would let the earth suffocate her and extinguish her life naturally. The ritual of her punishment was a silent spectacle of pure psychological horror. The condemned Vestal was violently stripped of her sacred garments, whipped and dressed in the simple shrouds of a walking corpse. She was placed inside a tightly closed wooden litter where her desperate screams could not be heard and her terrified face could not be seen by the public. She was paraded through the bustling forum, where the massive crowd parted in absolute dead silence, terrified that her curse would spread to them. Her final destination was the Campus Celeratus, which literally translates to the Cursed Field, located just outside the Colline Gate. Down deep in the dirt, a tiny underground chamber had been meticulously prepared for her arrival. Inside this hole there was a simple bed, a single lit oil lamp, and pitifully small portions of dry bread, water, milk, and oil. The presence of this meager food was not an act of mercy at all. It was a dark legal loophole, a technicality, so the high priests could look up at the gods and claim they did not starve her, but merely gave her provisions to survive. Whatever happened down in the dark next was simply considered the will of the gods. The weeping priestess was forced to climb down the wooden ladder into the dark, stinking hole. Once her feet touched the cold dirt, the ladder was swiftly pulled up. The entrance above her was sealed shut with heavy earth and stones pounding down from the surface until the ground above was perfectly level, completely erasing any trace that a living, breathing human being was trapped down there. The bustling city of Rome continued to pulse and thrive right above her head. The loud rumbling of wooden carts and the daily chatter of citizens were completely muffled by meters of packed dirt. Meanwhile, down in the suffocating darkness, she sat entirely alone. She would sit on that small bed and watch the tiny flame of her oil lamp flicker and finally die, plunging her into an eternal black nightmare. She would sit in that suffocating pitch-black tomb for days long before the agonizing thirst began to dry out her veins and turn her black blood thick and useless. But the eventual fall of Rome did not bring an end to this brutal practice. In fact, the Middle Ages took this creeping horror and refined it, bringing it right into the very walls that were supposed to offer divine salvation. The holy abbeys and the quiet monasteries of Europe. The monastic life was ruled by rigid, unforgiving laws. The horrifying truth is that breaking your vows in the Middle Ages, especially the vow of chastity, was not just seen as a simple human mistake. It was viewed as a demonic corruption, a stinking rot that had to be contained and completely extinguished before it infected the entire holy order. It was in this suffocating atmosphere of extreme religious paranoia that a terrifying and ironic term was born. Vade in pace. Go in peace. What sounds like a gentle final blessing from a priest was actually the brutal sentence for one of the most agonizing, lonely, and desperate deaths imaginable. Condemned monks and nuns found guilty of severe heresy or sexual transgressions were dragged down into the deep, damp crypts or shoved into narrow niches carved directly into the thick stone walls of the abbeys. Unlike the holy anchorites who voluntarily sealed themselves in small cells with little windows to pray and seek spiritual enlightenment, these condemned souls were violently forced into total oblivion. The medieval immurement ceremony had the heavy, dark solemnity of a literal funeral. The abbot or bishop would stand there in the flickering torchlight and coldly recite the prayers for the dead over a person who was still very much alive, shivering and sobbing in terror. The desperate victim was then forcefully pushed into the tight, stinking cavity in the wall. The executioner did not use a heavy axe or a guillotine. He simply used bricks. The last stone was brutally shoved into place, often leaving only a tiny crack no wider than a single human hand. Through this miserable little slit, small rations of dry bread and dirty water were pushed through until the supreme order was finally given to stop the feeding and let the darkness devour them. Imagine the sheer psychological torture of being physically trapped inside the thick stone wall of a massive, echoing cathedral. As you stand there, trapped in the freezing dark, you would clearly hear the beautiful Gregorian chants echoing through the halls. The sweet smell of holy incense would drift through the tiny cracks in your tomb. The grand liturgical life of the church would continue perfectly, just a few feet away from your rotting face. Divine salvation was right there, just on the other side of that cold, impenetrable stone. But you were condemned to suffer a literal hell on earth. The church, in its fanatical, bloody quest for absolute purity, paradoxically created the most terrifying torture chambers, where time and crushing loneliness were the true executioners, destroying the delicate human mind. Long before the pew's fragile body finally succumbed to the darkness. But do not let movies fool you into thinking that only fanatical priests committed these atrocities. While the church used immurement to punish spiritual sins, the wealthy nobility of Europe used the exact same method for bitter personal revenge. In the dark, isolated castles of the feudal lords, immurement became the ultimate weapon for jealous husbands, protecting their fragile honor, and brutal warlords, settling vicious inheritance disputes. The most frequent and tragic victim in these chilling domestic scenarios was the noble wife accused of adultery. In the ruthless feudal system, the bloodline was absolutely everything. A woman who birthed an illegitimate child threatened to tear apart the entire structure of power and wealth. However, publicly executing a high-ranking noblewoman on a pyre or with a sword could instantly trigger massive bloody wars between powerful rival clans. The cold, calculated solution was domestic disappearance. It was an intimate, horrifying form of murder that turned a supposedly safe home into a suffocating death trap. You hear chilling legends of white ladies haunting old castles from Germany to Hungary, but the brutal reality behind the ghost folklore will send shivers down your spine. A betrayed feudal lord would simply order his masons to hollow out a narrow vertical space in a thick load-bearing wall, often right inside a busy hallway, or even inside the couple's own private bedroom. The terrified, screaming wife was violently shoved inside, and the heavy stone wall was quickly rebuilt, sealing her in forever. The absolute sickening perversity of this brutal act lies in the extreme physical proximity. The cruel husband would just continue his normal daily routine. He would host massive, loud banquets, eating roasted meat and drinking heavy, dark wine just a few inches away from the exact spot where his wife was slowly and desperately agonizing. She would be completely trapped in the dark, hearing life continue without her. She would hear the distinct clinking of silver goblets, the roaring laughter of the drunken knights, and perhaps even the sweet, innocent voices of her own beloved children playing happily in the courtyard outside. This twisted auditory torture was meticulously designed to maximize her despair, constantly reminding the poor victim every single agonizing second of everything she had forever lost. There are terrifying historical accounts from castles in Eastern Europe claiming that the wet mortar used to seal these tombs was literally mixed with the desperate tears and bloody screams of the victims. The condemned woman was not just executed, she was permanently fused into the very architecture of the power structure she dared to challenge. The cruel architecture of this punishment was flawlessly designed to inflict maximum pain. The incredibly narrow niches forcefully forced the victim to remain standing upright or heavily crouched in terribly unnatural, painful positions. This quickly caused excruciating muscle cramps and massive circulatory blockages long before the crushing thirst or starvation became fatal. The Grand Castle, a supposed symbol of majestic power and protection, was secretly transformed into a massive, stinking living sarcophagus, hiding brutal dark secrets that would only be fully revealed centuries later when the massive stone walls finally began to crumble and decay. Now let us strip away all the romantic Gothic nonsense and face the naked, brutal biological reality of this nightmare. If it were you trapped in that wall, what exactly happens to your human body when it is tightly sealed in a confined dark space? Death by immurement is not a quick, merciful exit. It is a slow, terrifying marathon of pure agony. If the tiny stone space is completely airtight, the suffocating asphyxiation hits you first. The heavy carbon dioxide rapidly builds up in the dark cell. The stale air quickly becomes hot, wet, and impossible to breathe. Absolute sheer panic triggers your brain, dumping massive amounts of adrenaline into your bloodstream, forcing you to hyperventilate and breathe much faster, rapidly consuming whatever precious little oxygen is left. Violent, throbbing headaches, extreme mental confusion, and a terrifying physical sensation of drowning in dry air completely take over your body until you finally lose consciousness and the darkness mercifully ends your suffering. But in the vast majority of historical cases, those ancient stone walls were quite porous, allowing just enough air to seep through the cracks. This cruel design flaw condemned the trapped victim to a much, much worse fate. A slow, agonizing death by extreme dehydration and total multiple organ failure. Without a single drop of water, the fragile human body violently collapses in about 3 to 5 days. But in freezing, damp environments, like underground crypts or deep castle dungeons, this horrific dying process can drag on for more than a full agonizing week. Your tongue swells up so massively that it physically cannot fit inside your dry mouth anymore. Your lips and skin split and crack open. Your blood thickens rapidly, turning into a dark, toxic sludge clogging your veins. Your kidneys completely shut down, stopping the filtration of toxins and plunging your brain into a state of severe febrile delirium and madness. And then comes the absolute psychological horror. Staring into the pitch-black darkness, your desperate, starving brain, actively searching for any stimulation, begins to violently hallucinate. Your mind projects terrifying, flashing lights, distorted screaming faces, and hideous demonic monsters right onto the dark stone inches from your face. You completely lose all concept of time and your own human identity. To make this nightmare even worse, the tight confinement naturally attracts unwanted, hungry visitors. The overwhelming stench of your own cold sweat, your rotting human feces, and your pure chemical fear seeps out through the tiny cracks in the masonry, attracting swarms of diseased rats and flesh-eating insects. The ultimate terrifying impotence of being fully alive, totally conscious but physically unable to move your arms to swat away the hungry rodents that start nibbling on your toes and fingers, is perhaps the most chillingly horrific aspect of this brutal death. The entombed victim literally feels their own body turning into rotting carrion long before their frantically beating heart finally gives out. It is the absolute total degradation of the human condition, reduced to a pathetic, rotting piece of meat, suffering in the pitch-black dark, desperately scratching at the hard, unyielding stone until their bloody fingernails are completely torn off, leaving chilling, deep scratch marks that horrified modern archaeologists would eventually uncover centuries later. You might think this is all just a scary urban legend or a dark fairy tale meant to frighten misbehaving children. But modern archaeology has a very disturbing habit of proving our absolute worst historical nightmares are completely real. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, while conducting basic structural restorations on ancient grand abbeys and towering castles across Europe, completely unsuspecting construction workers knocked down strange, false walls and stumbled right into the unthinkable. In the cold ruins of Thornton Abbey in England, a completely intact human skeleton was discovered, hidden deep behind a thick stone wall. The skeletal remains were found sitting frozen in time, perfectly positioned at a small wooden table with an old rotting book open in front of him. This chilling scene strongly suggests a condemned monk was bricked up alive in a twisted act of forced penance or brutal punishment. The deep scratches and heavy trauma marks left on the old bones tell the final horrifying story. Some skeletons are found twisted in unnatural, contorted positions, desperately fighting the hard stone until their very last dying breath. Other skeletons possess a deeply unsettling serenity, as if they simply accepted their terrible fate, perhaps heavily drugged or locked in a deep religious trance as the darkness swallowed them. But the gruesome archaeological discoveries go far beyond simple criminal punishment. They touch upon a deeply disturbing ancient anthropological taboo: the brutal foundation sacrifice. Creepy old legends like the story of Master Manole in Romania or the Bridge of Arta in Greece tell dark tales of desperate builders who had to literally bury their own wives alive deep inside the massive foundations so the stone structures would not instantly collapse. Dark, ancient superstitions firmly dictated that any great, massive building strictly required a living human soul trapped inside to keep it standing tall. While many historians try to dismiss these legends as mere symbolic folklore, actual real-world excavations have uncovered horrifying evidence. Countless skeletons, mostly of poor children or animals, but occasionally full-grown adults, have been found tightly packed into the bases of medieval towers and massive stone bridges. These poor souls were not condemned criminals or heretics. They were completely innocent victims of a terrifying collective belief, ruthlessly sacrificed to magically strengthen the cold stone with their trapped, suffering spirits. Today, advanced forensic science can carefully analyze the ancient isotopes in the teeth of these skeletons, telling us exactly where they were born, what they ate, and exactly how they violently died. Every single ancient, beautiful stone wall you casually admire on your fun European tourist vacation might actually be hiding a terrifying, macabre secret. The true history of European architecture is not just built with mortar and heavy stone. It is literally built with human bones and suffocating silence. When we stand today and gaze up at the majestic, towering ruins of ancient castles or the peaceful serenity of massive old cathedrals, it is very easy to get swept away by the romantic, aesthetic beauty and completely forget the raw, brutal functionality that once actively operated within those dark, damp spaces. The horrific act of immuring living, breathing people remains one of the darkest and most chilling testaments to human creativity when it comes to inflicting pure evil and suffering. It was not enough to simply eliminate your bitter enemy or execute the sinful wrongdoer. It was absolutely necessary to completely erase them, to contain their rot, to forcefully fuse their screaming body into total dark oblivion. Whether it was driven by the untouchable purity of the Roman Vestals, the iron fist discipline of the fanatical monks, or the fragile, bloody honor of the feudal lords, the brutal act of sealing a human being behind solid stone reflects a deep, terrifying fear that human society has always had when dealing with its own dark failures. It was always much easier to simply hide the stinking problem behind a thick wall of red bricks and let the suffocating darkness do the dirty work. These dark histories are incredibly difficult to listen to, but they are absolutely necessary to remember. They finally give a loud, clear voice to those desperate souls who died, screaming in absolute silence, whose bloody, ripped-off fingernails scratching on the cold stone were the only silent witnesses to their agonizing final moments. Today, we are finally smashing through that heavy wall of historical silence. We have brought bright, glaring light into a place where there was only suffocating terror and absolute darkness. And now, the next time you casually walk past a massive, ancient stone wall, you might just feel a sudden cold chill run straight down your spine, knowing that real history is built on layers of horror that we would much rather pretend never existed. If this dark, terrifying dive into the abyss of the human soul kept you trapped here until the very end, if you could truly feel the heavy weight of the cold stone and the desperate lack of oxygen in your own lungs, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the Dark Ages right now. Help us dig up more terrifying historical mysteries that time tried to bury forever. I will be waiting for you down in the dark. See you in the next nightmare.